Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session Mobile Device Forensics, a beginner's guide. I'm Kainaz Badia, and I'll be your host for the day. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few house rules. For our attendees, the session will be in listen only mode and will last for an hour, out of which the last 15 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. Now about our speaker for today's session, Amber Schroader. Over the past 3 decades, Amber has been a driving force for innovations in digital forensic. Amber has developed many software programs, courses, and guide in the area of recovering data from smartphones, computer hardware drives, cloud email, and gaming system. She has established protocols for the seizure and processing of digital evidence that have been used by numerous organizations throughout the world. She has coined the concept of 360-degree approach to digital forensic and forensic of everything, that is FOE, with her focus on unique problems in digital evidence and solutions. Amber has been a significant industry influence in advocating for a big picture consideration of digital evidence. An accomplished design architect, curriculum developer, and instructor, Amber has written and taught numerous classes in this specialized field and has earned multiple certifications. She continues to contribute to the field through book contributions and other industry speaking engagements. Her final aim is clear: to educate stakeholders and create trust between crypto asset service providers, regulators, and the general public interested in blockchain technology and crypto assets. So without any further delay, I would like to hand over the session to our speaker, Amber.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here and to share kind of a foundational base for mobile device forensics. This is an area I'm very passionate about. You all just had my introduction, so there you go. I'm Amber. I'm happy to connect with you guys on LinkedIn, etc. But the big thing that I want to get through is a passion for mobile forensics. I've been doing it for since 2001. So before mobiles were really cool mobiles, they were more PDA style mobiles. I have always loved these small devices and the interesting aspects they bring in our digital investigations as we go into them. In the beginning, they were not a primary device that we were looking at when we were doing digital forensics. They became very secondary because they were still kind of an accessory. Now they've become kind of the primary device in digital forensics. So let's look at the field of digital forensics in general. And I believe most of these are probably covered in your essential series from EC Council. But we start out with our core, which is digital forensics. That's really the discipline of doing all the different types of digital investigations. You can then specialize into different areas. So you can work in live forensics and deal with primarily memory dumps and anything that is captured in a live environment. We can do old school computer forensics. So sometimes it's called dead box forensics because we're imaging computers. In that aspect, we might have subsets of it as our data sets have grown so large. We also have cloud forensics and we even have remote investigations. But the area I'm going to focus on today is really about that mobile forensics aspect. I can't talk about mobile forensics without mentioning the fact that mobile forensics really touches into IoT forensics as well. They become close cousins to one another because a lot of the data will exist in both places. So a lot of times we will see shared information between those two different disciplines. But if you are interested in the field of digital forensics, you can see that there's a lot of different areas that you can focus on. Most investigators have skills within all of those different spaces. Because I've been doing it for so long, I've worked in each one of these different areas. But one of the things is I like to then have special skills that are focused on one, which is where that mobile forensics side comes in. So what is mobile forensics? I'm sure you're probably going, well, I sure hope I find that out. That's what the whole webinar is about. But it's really about examining smartphones, SIM cards, GPS, PDAs, feature phones, all of those different mobile devices that are out there and the things that are associated with them. So if I have a smartphone, I also typically have a SIM card. I might have a media card if I'm using an Android device. I might have that smartphone connect into the cloud, so I'm going to have to add that as part of my investigation. It's talking to a cellular tower, so I have different records that come from a CDR, so a call detail record. All of those things are really what makes up mobile forensics. And it's one of the reasons that I became more passionate about this particular area than some of the others, is because it has a lot of aspects to it. So if you're one of the people like myself that can get really bored if you do the same thing every day in and out, and it's not an exciting thing for you, then this is a great area for you, because I have never in my entire career had two devices that process the exact same way, that end up having the same data. It's always different. And that difference is part of what makes mobile forensics so exciting, is I don't have to worry about that mundane, I'm doing that over and over again and getting the same results every time. So what is the biggest problem we're facing in mobile forensics? Besides not having enough people that are working on it, because there's always a shortage of people, it's really about proprietary data. So as we have all these different devices, and I have piles and piles of them here on my desk, each one of them has its own version of a firmware or an operating system associated with it. It's got different flavors that happen between this Pixel Android and the Samsung Android or the LG Android that might be here, versus my iPhones. Each one of them, because they behave so differently, they all have proprietary data, which means that there's a lot more research and development that goes into mobile forensics than some of the other fields. If I examine a computer, I'm going to get the same results off of a Windows 11 machine that was manufactured by Dell than I will get on one that's manufactured by another company. And so because of that, I know I'm going to have some consistency. The world of mobile forensics is just not like that. It is a lot of randomness, and because of that, we have a proprietary data problem. The other barrier that we have associated with mobile forensics is, of course, all the locks associated with the phones. There's always going to be a problem in getting into these different devices because we're playing a tug of war, and that tug of war comes between our desire for privacy as individuals and the desire for access for an investigation associated with these very devices. And because of that, we have a struggle, and part of that happens with proprietary data. So let's talk about your skills. You're like, okay, so I know I'm going to have a problem. It's a lot of proprietary data. It's going to be a lot of research. So that's, first of all, your very first skill that you need to have in the world of mobile forensics. You have to love diving into that data, getting in and understanding when I'm going into an app, what are the pieces of data that make that app work, where are they located, and how do they relate to one another? All of that is something that you will do every day. Despite the many different tools out there, and we're going to talk about those, you still have to have a core skill of being able to research it and really dive into what that data is really meaning in your investigation. And that's what we're going to spend some time with today. The next one is about writing. You have to be a good writer. And I know some of you are probably thinking, I now have AI that can do that for me. As good as AI is at writing, because it really annoys me at times, because I will put something into AI and I'm like, crap, it did write it better than I did. I get disappointed because I feel I'm a good writer. I still have to give it something to work with. So make sure that you have the ability to write clearly and concisely throughout your process, because you're going to be sharing data as part of your investigation with other people. You do not live as an island. It's not just data for yourself. You know there are other people involved in that investigation. And because of it, you got to have good writing skills. The other sides of it, patience. I mentioned that those mobile devices, they don't behave the same every time you process them. And they don't. They're actually a lot of maintenance. It's kind of like dealing with a whole pile of puppies all the time. And every puppy wants to do different things. That's what it feels like when you're dealing with all these different mobile devices, and it can be frustrating because they're not going to always acquire easily. They're not always going to show you all the data you want to have. And so you have to have a lot of patience with it, because it is a lot of repeat of going in and let me try that acquisition again. Let me put it through another tool, whatever it may be. But you do need patience when dealing with mobile devices, because there's a lot of changes that happen between them, and their wear and tear happens as well, because they're going with a different user or suspect and they're getting worn around in a pocket. They don't work the same as someone carrying around a laptop. So you have to be patient for that. The others is practice. And I know this is the #1 thing that I get asked when I'm on LinkedIn and the different social medias is how do I get practice? How do I get some experience in this field? Because I really love it and I want to be part of it. It's a hard thing because a lot of people don't want to hire you if you don't have experience. It's kind of a catch-22 if you want to think of it that way. This is when you have to go out and volunteer. And I say that because I spent time finding some different nonprofits out there. And I said, I want to use my cyber and my digital forensic skills for good, and I want to help them. I volunteered to help them. I wrote procedures for them, policies, security plans, policies for when they had someone leave the organization, what they should do with them forensically, when they had data from the organization, all of that. That builds up my experience. Now, I don't do it to add on to my resume. I do it because I want to help other people with it, but you can use those types of opportunities to build up your resume by volunteering for different organizations and saying, hey, I understand this, I have these skills, let me see how I can help you with it. The last one, of course, is get some certifications. You just saw a great video about some wonderful essential certifications out there that EC Council offers. Those are great ways for you to get started into the field. No matter what you do, whenever you enter a field, especially like digital forensics that changes all the time, and especially the mobile side of it, it's always in flux. And because of that, you're always going to be learning. There's always going to be something new. Something's going to trend up and something else is going to trend down, and you're going to have to learn about it. So that constant desire to learn is critical to make sure that you get those skills required. Now, one of the things I always like to point out, because no one ever talks about this, but I am dyslexic. And so because I am dyslexic, I'm also ADD. I'm sure you probably noticed that in there, and a little bit of OCD. So I have a couple neurodivergences associated with me and how my brain works. Because of those, I actually ended up being better at digital forensics and mobile forensics than some of the others, because my brain naturally thought through the process backwards. So don't think just because you might do things just a little bit differently that this isn't a good fit for you. It might be the perfect fit for you, because my ability to naturally do things backwards has helped me to go through and find data in a case better than someone who maybe thinks through it the other direction. So just keep that in mind, is that there's always a good place for you. And I think the field of cyber in general is a great place for all of us that might think just a little bit differently. So let's talk about what we're going to do. So our basic evidence handling. So there are a lot of processes and procedures, and I mentioned my OCD there. This is why my OCD gets happy when it comes to doing any type of forensics, because we have a set process and procedure that makes it a science and not an art. So I have a chain of custody. That's my record that makes sure that from me touching it to the next person touching it to the next person touching it, there's a record of it. I'm a little bit of a germaphobe, and so of course there's always wear gloves when you're processing your devices. And the big reason behind that as well is I want you to think of how dirty mobile phones are. There's a lot of biological forensics associated with them, so you want to make sure you preserve everything. Then I like to document my procedures. So what happens if the port on my device is damaged? I need to document what I did to try to get it to communicate to my computer. All of those become part of that process, and I keep notes with every investigation that I do. And then the last one is I understand what I'm getting with the different devices. So I have an expectation of my data. That way I know I have a baseline of what I should be seeing on the device, and when I see things that are off of that behavioral baseline, that's going to tell me that might be where I'm going to go and investigate further. That might be a key to pieces of evidence that I'm looking for in my investigation. So let's kind of get into that next step. So I've got my gloves on, I'm ready to preserve. So when I go through and I do a preservation of evidence associated with mobile devices, I have an extra step. And that extra step is because of how a mobile device communicates versus another type of digital evidence. So we have two types of wireless signals out there. We have our pull wireless, which is where we pull an authentication token, and that's what grants us our wireless access. So we do that with our laptops. We can do that with our mobile devices as well. However, the mobile device's primary communication is through push wireless, and that push wireless is something that we don't get to control in our investigative process because it is pushed out from a tower and I don't control how good of a signal my mobile device is going to get. Because we have to deal with all those different diversifications with signals going to our device, we have issues of what our integrity will be with our evidence. That's when we have to do an extra step. And this is the only type that you have to do it with. I do this with IoT as well. Again, I mentioned that they're kind of touching and they're cousins, but I don't always have to do this with a laptop I would be seizing or a desktop I would be seizing. So I have to use the Faraday technology. Faraday technology is one of those necessary steps to make sure I'm preserving my evidence in the best way possible. Because once I capture my mobile device, I want to put it inside a Faraday cage that is creating that cone of silence. It's an old reference. I watched that when I was very, very young. And once it goes in there, none of that signal is going to get out. Because if signal keeps coming into my device after I take it in as evidence, then my evidence is changing, which is a hard no in the world of mobile forensics. So because of that, we use Faraday technology. So this is an example of a Faraday bag or an EMI shielding bag. That's what the patent is associated with this bag. And this is a bag that I designed in the many, many years ago because I realized that there was a problem. You never know when you're going to get inspired by what you do in your work. And this was part of what I got inspired with, is I knew we needed to be able to capture mobile devices and make sure they didn't get signal anymore. Because if they did, my evidence would be violated. So that's when I put together the invention for the EMI shielding bag. So make sure you're paying attention to your extra seizure and processing procedures that go into place when you work with mobile evidence. So now that we have got our chain of custody going, we know we're wearing gloves, we're processing in a Faraday cage, the last thing we have to do is we have to really understand our data and start getting into it to be able to capture it. And I know you're probably looking at this screen and going, this is an interesting explanation. She has a coloring book on the page. I do because it's a great way to explain your two primary areas that you're going to be looking at when you look at mobile devices. So on one side, I have just the plain coloring book page of this ant. I have an Apple logo associated with it because this is how Apple works. Apple works where you have to color in the lines. So every time I process an Apple device, I'm going to have the exact same process happen because Apple doesn't allow me to do unique things in that process. They want that ant to be a red ant or a black ant, no other choices. So they're going to say, this is a black ant with a red tongue and green graphs, no choices. And it will always be that way. So my expectation of data I have from my Apple devices is very strict. It's very much in those lines. And because of it, you don't get a lot of changes that happen between a tool A, a tool B, a tool C. I'm going to get generally the same data. That's great. It's easy for us to understand that, and we know we're going to understand a certain amount of information that comes from those devices. Now, if we switch over to that Android side, that Android side is actually all about not coloring in those lines. It wants you to be as creative as possible in how you interact with it. And that's why it's supported by such a large variety of different manufacturers. And I was mentioning my Pixel is going to behave differently than my Samsung device is going to behave, or my Motorola device is going to behave. And because of it, I have to adjust my expectation of data for every type of device that I interact with, because I will also have different behavior patterns that come from the different providers to these devices. So if I have a burner Samsung device, or I have one that comes from a carrier, I'm going to get different data based on each one of those devices, and I have to adjust. So that's where it colors outside the lines. It might add additional things to it, as you can see from my example here. You just have to be prepared for a lot of different things. And that's where that diversity comes in that says, hey, I like having something new every time I work with it, and I'm going to be intrigued by it. I have always learned something new from every examination I've done, and I've processed thousands of different phones at this point. So once I have an expectation of the data, I know what I should be expecting off of this device that I'm going to be working with, I have to go and acquire it. So that acquisition side of it is where we start getting into a little bit more of the tech side. So our goals are, my tools should write as little as possible to the device. I don't want them leaving a whole bunch of forensic fingerprints inside my potential suspect's data. I don't want them to leave anything at all, which is my second rule, which is always remove your work. And I say that because some tools will use agents in order to be able to access the information and go back and forth. Because of that, you want to make sure they don't leave anything behind. That's not something that is part of you forever, so make sure you pick it up and take it with you. There's a lot of verification or validation that goes into the processes of mobile forensics because we have to retest our tools. We don't work with things like microscopes and things like that, where you would on the biological forensic side, but we work with software. And because we work with software, we have to make sure that software is doing what we said it was going to do or what we had an expectation of what it's going to do. Just because a manufacturer has tested it and released it for sale does not mean that it is verified and valid. That's something that you have to do back at the lab yourself because you have to know it does what you think it should be doing. And the last one is your goal is to always access as much data as possible. Of course, that's the goal. Now, to get there, there's a lot of different paths that lead into getting as much data as possible. You might be rooting a phone. You might be doing a chip dump of a phone. You might be doing a file system dump. You might be doing a logical image, and you still get some of that recoverable data associated with that phone. So there's a lot of different paths to get to the point that you are actually getting an acquisition of that device. But these basic rules, these top three that I mentioned, writing as little as possible, removing your work, and making sure it's validated and verified, those are things that happen no matter what type of tool you're going to use. That's part of the forensic process and part of the core of what is making us a science as opposed to an art. Now you're probably wondering why I have this weird picture on the side here of this man, he's enjoying his sandwich. And this is just a good reminder to you visually that says when you walk into a crime scene, you don't walk in there eating a sandwich, dropping pieces of your sandwich everywhere. It's the same when the world or your crime scene is digital. It's the same when it's a mobile device. You don't just leave pieces behind. You've got to make sure you're keeping it clean and you're following that process and the science into it. So let's talk about tools. And I know you're probably expecting that I would have a whole bunch of screenshots of different tools out there, and I don't. What I do have is an example of a toolkit. So here's a toolbox, and in this toolbox, you see how many different screwdrivers are in there because you never know what length of screwdriver you're going to need. Do you need a Phillips head? Do you need a flat head? Do you need a hex head? All of those different choices that you have for screwdrivers is why we all have multiple of them in our toolkit. And that's the same reason in the field of mobile forensics, we all have multiple tools we use in our toolkit. We never stick to just one. It doesn't matter if one has bigger marketing or brand recognition than another tool. We always want to have as many as possible in our toolkit because we never know when we're going to have a device that is not going to work with maybe the most marketed tool that we have to use with a less marketed tool. So you have to be prepared with having lots and lots of different tools. And it's as many as you can possibly have, because the other rule of thumb we have in mobile forensics, and we have in digital forensics in general, is we always use the rule of two, which means that I am always using two tools to process the exact same device. Because no matter what, because there's so much of that proprietary data in there, I'm going to get different results. And because of that, I want as much perspective as possible into that mobile device. That's going to make sure I find the evidence that I'm looking for. So here's an example of your acquisition. These are really the basics. So I put Apple inside the lines because remember, Apple requires you to always color inside the lines. This is roughly what your expectation is going to be when you're processing an Apple device. You're going to typically have a manifest.plist file, which is a representation of a backup of that device, and that's what's going to be parsed and processed by the different tools. That parsing and processing is where you get a huge difference on how different tools will see the data, because it's all in how they decided to research the data that is created from those backups. I can go through and I will have a logical image of it. So that's what those are going through and creating. And I'm going to still have to understand those little data points within it. If I have a jailbroken image, depending on the firmware, that's when I'm going to get more data because I'm able to go into that file system portion of the device. But no matter what, that Apple acquisition is always kept within the lines and parameters of what Apple allows. If I go and look at what Android is doing with the devices, I'm typically going to have an ADB or an Android debug bridge communication with the device. I might have a backup done with it. I might downgrade different apps. I might choose to root the device. All of those different things, from physical images to chip dumps, that's some of the diversification you get when it comes to Android, because each one is going to behave much different than how I would see out of a standard Apple device. You have one primary manufacturer, one primary chip. That makes it a lot easier. It's Android that's probably going to give you more headaches than Apple will ever give you, because at least you have a set expectation of data with your imaging, where on Android, it's going to be hit and miss based on what you get with those. It's why you always have more than one tool. So where is all this data coming from? We have proprietary data, we have different methods to acquire it, and I want you to think of how people actually use their devices and where they use their devices. This is actually impactful because they're doing constant data changes. If you think of what you do every morning when you wake up, the first thing you probably do is pick up your mobile device. It might be your alarm. Very few people have old school alarm clocks anymore. So keeping that in mind, it's going to change the way that you look at that data. It's actually the best live representation of what I call someone's digital fingerprint, because they're constantly making those adjustments. When you have to actually take it in the shower with you, you know that they're constantly going to be addicted, and that addiction is going to bring you the data you're looking for in your investigation. So this is what we look for. We have the who, what, when, where, and why of mobile forensics. And that's what I'm going to break down some data examples for you. These are kind of the old school, whenever you did like an investigation or you wrote a paper when you maybe were in high school, these are the areas that you would focus on. It's kind of the same thing when you're doing an investigation. I go through and I talk to whoever is my client in this case, and I say, who are we looking for? What's happened? When did it happen? Where did it happen? And why are we looking for this information? And that's kind of the dialogue that I'll have back and forth before I start diving into the actual data I'm going to investigate. So let's dive in. So who is involved? When I want to find out that information on a smartphone, one of the first things I'm going to look for is associated with the properties. Every type of device, whether it be Android or Apple, is going to have a properties area that is associated with that device. That's going to tie it back to its IMEI. It's going to tie it back to its provider, because again, its goal is to actually be a phone above all other things. I know that's crazy because we use it for everything else but making phone calls. But I see in here that I can have my device name. When I have my device name, I should see other relationships within the other data that are going to relate back to that device name. When I don't, then that tells me maybe more than one person might be accessing the same device or using it. That's when I start seeing things on their social media accounts. So why would I have one ID associated with the phone and then another email or ID associated with the social media that have two totally different names? That could be a dual access phone, which means two people might be using it. That tells me I need to go more into the who side of my investigation. What did they do, or what did they say? This is when we start looking into perhaps the text messages associated with this, or in this case, we see iMessages in here. And there's a couple important things when we start getting into the what did they say or do, which is where did it come from? So was it an iMessage? Was it an SMS? Did Siri send it versus the individual actually typing out the messages? As we see AI start coming more and more into our devices, those tiny pieces of what we call metadata about the messaging can be really impactful. Because what if it wasn't me? What if Siri just decided to send this, or Bixby decided to send it off of Samsung? I want to make sure I'm keeping track of that information. And then, of course, how was it being sent out? Did it actually go out? Was it in the outbooks? All of those little pieces. Did it have geolocation information? All of that is going to matter to us when we start diving into the data associated with it. So what did they say? So here's another good example for you, because in this one, we see not only the text preview of what they said, but we also see that they had geolocation data turned on. So I get to my next step in my investigation by looking at a piece of data from the other portion. And this is where I always find it very exciting as I start putting the different data together, that it's that research component that I mentioned. If you like looking into this and saying, hey, Jessica was at this location when she said, hey, no, I can't find this, then that's part of what you want to get excited about entering into this field. So when did they say it? So when did they post? This is an example in a dating app. So this is inside Tinder. So we see when they were talking to the person. We see, was it regular intervals? Was it spread out over a period of time? Because people will pop into a dating app and then pop back out again. And so we kind of see what that behavior pattern is. Does their other data match or does it not? Do we see other information like, did they actually view the data that it was sent over, or have they not viewed the message that occurred at 2 in the morning? All of those are going to be impactful into our investigation. When they were doing certain things. This is an important aspect because I mentioned earlier that there's a whole field about live forensics and doing RAM capture associated with computers and dealing memory images. The same thing actually happens despite the fact that all of a phone is a memory image, but it happens when it comes to mobile devices as well. And we have the ability to tell whether or not the phone was doing the change or if it was the person. One of the hardest parts about mobile forensics and digital forensics in general is putting the person behind the keyboard, or in our case, behind the device. And this is one of those aspects that allows us to do that through the data by reading the active memory of what was happening into this particular Android phone. I can say the person chose to move this screen to the front versus the machine chose to do it, because your smartphone is constantly making changes without your choices involved. And it's important when it comes to mobile forensics to know who is doing what. So where were they? Always a fun one. Of course, everyone always goes, oh, it's geolocation data, it's always turned on. You'd be surprised how often it's actually turned off. So finding the latitude and longitude associated with different things like messaging to say this is where they were when they were sending the message, to match it up with maybe triangulation data, which is data that comes from our call detail records. To be able to put the phone in a physical location can actually be quite complex. Believe it or not, you don't even typically use a general forensic tool to do that. You might just use an Excel spreadsheet and some pivot tables. There's lots of different ways to say where a device was at a given time. One of the important things to remember, though, is that we have one advantage in our investigation, which is on our circuit boards associated with our phones is, of course, a geolocation chip. So we have always an ability to match it back in, and we're always talking to a satellite to get some of that information. That gives us some pretty solid data to say where the phone was at a given time. The problem is you have to go through and look it up, because as you might note there looking on the screen, it's really just a string of numbers. So you have to be able to understand that those numbers equal coordinates when you're starting to look through the different pieces of data. Another example for you that's not as obvious to you. So I've had a case where I had someone have their GPS chip just turned off, their location services were disabled and everything. And I'm like, I gotta figure out where this device was at a given time. That's when you have to think outside that box and go, oh wait, let me check the browser history. Because the browser history might tell me that they were going to map to a particular location and they didn't want to do it through the mapping tool. So they looked it up in their browser to see the direction they needed to go to get there. Just remember, everyone decides to use their device a little differently. So again, don't get stuck in that box. Being able to think differently about the problem is going to lead you to more data. Other example for you, walking routes. This is where we had that little teeny pushover into our IoT, because this came from a Fitbit device that then integrated and synchronized with our smartphone. Those types of data points are happening all the time, but now I have the coordinates and a walking trail and how far they actually walked. So I have a really fast ability to say exactly where my phone was at a particular time. IoT helps us quite a bit with that. So our last little section is the why. So this is the hardest area to actually answer in a mobile investigation, is the why, because sometimes all of our data doesn't end up telling us why something happened. It gives us all of the background to a problem that might need to be solved, but it doesn't tell us the why behind it. And that's where you're going to have the hardest struggle. That's when you end up having to just present the data. And when you present that data, you might be doing it to clients, a court, an agency, a variety of different places. And that's when you get to do, how does the data equal the why? Give me 1 second. All right. So this is the writing skills. I brought those up in the very beginning as a skill that you needed to have. There's a lot of reports that you have to write, and you might have different iterations of the exact same report. I've written one report like 10 times because they wanted it written a different way. They wanted data displayed a different way. All those different things start coming into play. So I still like to be concise and precise. I always do it in drafts. When I provide over the information, I make sure that I'm giving the sections, where did it come from, all of those other details that we just went through are provided over to someone else. Sorry about that. Oh, I'm going to cough again. Hang on. Sorry about that. All the talking, I'm like dry throat. So once we put together our report of everything, the last thing we do is we're going to present that data to someone. We might present it using a tool. We might do it through timeline. We might talk about our hash values, which is how we match up the different data. We might talk about our chain of custody. We might do comparisons. All of that comes into play when we present the data, because when you present the data, you want to present the entire process that you just went through. This is when you're showing your science, not your art. So what were the steps that you followed as you went through the different pieces of the data? Who, what, when, where, why? All of that comes into place when you end up presenting it. And you might present it in testimony. You might just present it in a very long report. You might present it in an oral presentation to a client. You never know. But being able to have kind of the combination of all those different skills, from the research to the writing to going through that scientific process, is part of what makes your presentation so important, because that's what really shows that hard work that you put in the entire way. All right, so now I have taken you through an entire mobile forensic process. We didn't do a whole phone together, I get it, we have a limited amount of time that we could do that in, but I've really taken you through kind of that process that I would go through every day as a mobile forensic investigator, as I would go through each individual device in an investigation. And I wouldn't finish an entire device in a day. It usually takes much longer to do that as you start diving into the data. Because if you think about it, an average person has 150 plus apps on their phone. Most people have way more than that. That's a lot of data for you to go through and review. And because of that, the process for an individual phone might take quite a while to get through. So let's open it up to questions. Hopefully I don't cough anymore, and see what questions you guys have.
Thank you very much for delivering such an insightful and informative session. We found the webinar very engaging and hope it was valuable for you as well. So before we begin with our Q&A part, I would like to inform all the attendees that today's session is in sync with EC Council's Essential Series certification. As the cyber threat landscape evolves, early career cyber professionals need to develop proficiency in multidimensional skills to detect and thwart cyber attacks. The Essential Series from EC Council helps you gain a solid foundation across 8 key domains, such as ethical hacking, network defense, cloud security, IoT security, threat intelligence, digital forensics, SecOps, and security operations. The course offers immense learning experience through labs, courseware, engaging videos, material, capstone project, CTF challenges, and an exam to certify the participant knowledge. If you're interested to know more, kindly take part in the poll that's going to be conducted now. Let us know your preferred mode of training and we'll reach out to you. So shall we start with the Q&A, Amber?
Yep, absolutely.
Great then. So our first question is, in mobile forensic investigation, what are the key challenges you face when extracting and analyzing data from smartphone, and what techniques or tools do you employ to overcome these challenges?
So the biggest barrier, like I mentioned, is proprietary data. So one of the hardest things is that there's so many different apps out there. So as I mentioned, lots of people have different apps on their phone, and you really have to understand the app in order to be able to understand the data it produces. And so that is one of the problems that you face, is it's just a very large range of knowledge that you have to have about all these different things. The other one associated with the acquisitions, one of the things is, of course, employing more than one tool. I produce a tool that the industry uses. I use that as my primary tool. I use other tools as my secondary tool. And the way that I pick my different tools that I use when I'm doing an investigation is usually based on the type of device I'm investigating. So one tool might be really great at Android, but not as great at Apple. And so I might pick that tool when I'm using it for an Android device, and then I might pick a different tool when I'm using an Apple device and doing an acquisition there. There is a lot of research that goes into the field as a technology provider as well. And you see that from all the different pieces of technology out there, because obviously they're not, a $100 tool that you can go out and buy to be able to do this. They're usually a bit more expensive than that, but there's a range. You don't have to always start with the most expensive tool out there to be able to get good results in your digital forensics. I think that's a misnomer. There is some open source options as well. I use some of the open source tools as some of my secondary tools to validate my primary tool as well. So it's always good to have that mix up between them. So that's kind of a general understanding of it, but don't get caught up in just a brand name. Make sure the tool does what it says it does. I think that's an important aspect.
Thank you, Amber. We'll go for the next question. For someone interested in specializing in mobile device forensic, what skills and knowledge areas should they focus on?
I think they should really focus on research. And I say that it's kind of a mix. I think it would be good to have some skills in programming as well, understanding how phones really work and how apps are created, I think is really important, because a lot of digital forensic people were never programming in the first place, and so they may not have that connection to it. So I think having some skills in Python would be very beneficial. But I really think understanding the structure of the data with it, so SQLite, plist files, JSON files, all of those different types of files that actually create the apps that we use on our phones, and understanding those data points is hugely important, because you do have to put it together. So an example is, what happens if my suspect was primarily communicating through Clash of Clans? This is not an app that my tool is going to automatically parse for me. And so I, as an investigator, I'm going to have to put all those pieces together myself, which means I have to understand the databases that created that game, and then where they might be having data points that I could actually have left behind. So the live chat that happens while they're playing the game, where is that data located? And you have to be able to understand how to go through a fairly complex tree structure to find that information. So I think understanding how apps actually work, since they're not going away, is really important. And of course, having a really good understanding of things like SQLite, that seems to be like the winning database of all the databases out there. I think that would be a hugely valuable skill to have specialized in this field.
Thank you. The next one is, what are the latest tools and software commonly used in mobile device forensics?
So the tools that are used in mobile device forensics, and I will probably forget some, you have anything from Celebrite has a tool, to Graykey, which is only available to law enforcement, to Paraben has E3, Oxygen, Belkasoft, Autopsy is an open source tool, and it uses the leaps, which is ALEAP and iLeap. All of those are different tools that do mobile forensics, and I'm sure I missed someone in there, and I'm so sorry. Microsystemation has a tool. I think that's most of them. It's not a lot of different tools out there, but there are, you know, a dozen different types out there that people choose from, and they range in price quite dramatically between them. And most people try to buy, I believe, more than one of them. I think that's happened a little less lately because the price tags have changed so much, but having more than one is critical. That is part of the forensic process. That's part of the verification and validation steps. You have to be using more than one tool.
Thank you. Next one is, are you finding iOS getting harder to do forensic on, or Android as they update their software?
It's kind of a mix. So the part that's more difficult with iOS is actually breaking into the device. That is harder. Doing a logical investigation, so this is when it is not locked, you're able to get into the data, or you have the key to get into the data on iOS, that part is not difficult. So understanding their data structure, they're very reliable in their structure, so it's pretty easy to then break it down within that. The Android side of it is more difficult as well to get into past the lock side of it, but because of the way they use their chips, there's a little more options with it, where you can't do that on the Apple side of it. But the data structure on the Android side, it's similar. I mean, if I play Angry Birds on an iPhone and I play Angry Birds on an Android, I'm going to see very similar data structure between the two of them. It's just being able to get past that file system barrier on whether or not I'm going to be able to see all the different apps. But because Android is not as locked down as the Apple device is in its structure, I can use different techniques to get into that app data. So I can downgrade an app, I can root an Android device. But we are having a definite struggle between privacy and access. And I think that's going to increase over time. And I think the other thing that's going to change is a lot of our device, although we live very centric to our device, I think a lot more of that data, instead of being stored local to the device, is going to go into the cloud. I should have mushed my cloud forensics closer to my mobile forensics bubble in my example, because they are starting to touch more and more.
Okay, so we'll be taking the last two questions for the day, Amber. Okay. Would you describe a roadmap for learning, like what are the skills to master, coding, etc., for mobile forensic devices?
So, okay, it's a tough question. So the roadmap to learning, I would start out, and this is not going to be something you're expecting, but I would start out with making sure that you have one of each type of device, meaning if you're an Apple user, you need to have an Android device. If you're an Android user, you need to have an Apple device. Because I think the biggest problem you have is that people get in a habit of using the exact same phone, and they say, I really love Apple, so that's the device I want to use, or I really love Android. If you don't have the perspective on how either of those devices work and function, you can't investigate them. You're not going to understand Android as well if you've never used Android. And the same with Apple. I'm not going to understand Apple as well if I don't use Apple. So you need to make sure that you start your journey with having one of each device, and then start by researching how those devices work. I think core understanding and learning, you can get it through Python, through SQLite, and then you need to really understand just the handling principles and obviously the rules of forensics, which I'm sure you learn in your essentials program, but then get into different tools and get certified in as many different tools as possible, because that's what's going to get you through the who, what, when, where, why path. Is by using all the different tools, you'll be able to say, I know exactly where I should be seeing the who data, despite where my tool is going to tell me. And that's when you get that manual skill, is after you've used a bunch of them, you kind of get into that data. But the first step is actually using both devices. I know that sounds really silly, but you do get very centric to the type of device you use every day, and that does not make a good mobile forensic examiner. What makes a good one is one that understands how both of them work and can navigate and use them, and understand how their potential suspect also uses them.
Thank you. And we'll go with the last question for the day. What are the disadvantages of forensics?
The disadvantages of mobile forensics are, it's very frustrating. I think in digital forensics in general, it's a very frustrating field, because things do not always behave the way that they should, because they're not coming from off the shelf, they're coming from someone using them. And when people use technology, technology changes how it actually functions and works. The other disadvantages that you have is you really only have two sides of a career path, which means I can go and I can work on the private sector side, which means I'm going to be doing consulting jobs. I'll probably have to also have some malware investigation skills and kind of go on that cyber with a forensics afterthought almost on that private sector side. And the other side of it is the public sector. So you've got to work either in law enforcement or the government somewhere, and that's where you're going to be able to find your job. It's very hard to get in between those two areas where it's starting your own firm, that type of thing, because that's hard to get kind of the headway to get the regular business in and be able to make sure you're maintaining a career in that area. It's rare that you have a job that is so very black and white on one side or the other that you're able to work in, and that's really it. And I think that's probably one of the big frustrations a lot of people have when they're entering the field, is maybe they did not have the idea that they were going to be law enforcement, and so they don't explore that side. But remember, you can work on a law enforcement public sector side without being a sworn officer. Many times the digital forensic lab will be done with civilians instead of with law enforcement officers. It's kind of a mix. And the very last thing that's a big disadvantage in the world of digital forensics and mobile forensics in particular is when you process through a lot of these devices, you're looking at someone because they're a suspect of something, and you see the very worst side of their humanity when you start going through their data. Don't expect to always feel like great about your suspect, like, oh, they seem like they're a great person, or wherever it may be. Chances are you're going to find that they're not as great of a person as you had hoped they would be. And because of that, that can actually be very hard on you mentally. So there is that side of it that I don't think it's emphasized enough with people, is that it is a mentally taxing job to look through people's data. It is very hard to find out what people have actually said in the binary of ones and zeros versus what you might have thought they said. So keep that in mind, as you have to be mentally prepared as well to do anything in the field of forensics.
Thank you once again, Amber, for answering those questions and for a great presentation and the knowledge that you shared with our global audiences. It was a pleasure to have you with us, and we're looking forward for more and more sessions with you. So before we conclude with the webinar, would you like to give a small message to our audiences, Amber?
I think my biggest message to everyone is you don't know until you try. Experiment and sign up for trials, experiment into the field, process your own devices, get those test devices. That's what's going to tell you on whether or not digital forensics and mobile forensics is something you're going to be passionate about, because if you're passionate about it, you will love it every day that you work on it.
Thank you so much, Amber, for the message to the audiences.